The first sound Malcolm Reed heard that morning wasn't metal. It was a church bell, low, hollow, slow enough to feel old. The kind of sound that hangs in humid southern air, a little longer than it should. He stood near the edge of the Mississippi shipping channel, with a paper cup of burnt coffee cooling in his hand, while fog rolled over the river in thin gray ribbons. Behind him, diesel generators hummed beside portable floodlights that had been running all night. Ahead of him, the Jefferson Drawbridge leaned 3 degrees off alignment over black water, and stopped an entire section of Louisiana freight traffic from moving. 3 degrees, that was all it took. A 40-year-old bridge carrying steel, grain, fuel, and shipping containers across Baton Rouge had frozen in place, after Hurricane Evelyn pushed a debris barge sideways into the rotating span 2 nights earlier. Since then, 6 tugboats, 2 structural teams, and 1 emergency engineering contractor had failed to move it. Now the city was bleeding money by the hour. Malcolm rubbed sleep from his eyes and stared at the bridge again. The rotation lock assembly on the west side had twisted during the impact. The bridge wasn't collapsed. That was the problem. If it had fully failed, the solution would have been obvious. Instead, the entire structure sat trapped in tension, like a jaw half clenched. "You're late," the voice came sharp behind him. Dana Mercer walked down the temporary steel ramp with a tablet tucked under one arm and rainwater darkening the shoulders of her Navy field jacket. She was vice president of Urban Access Infrastructure and one of the youngest executives in the company's history. 39 years old, Stanford engineering degree, National Transportation Board consultant before private industry recruited her away for triple the money. Everything about her moved fast. Even her silence felt scheduled. Malcolm checked his watch. 6:07 a.m. 7 minutes, he said. "You missed the briefing. I was here till 2, so was everyone else." She kept walking before he could answer. That was Dana's style. No yelling, no drama. Just pressure applied continuously until people either hardened or cracked. Malcolm followed her toward the operations trailer, while forklifts beeped through the fog, and crews swapped night shift for day shift under portable floodlights. The whole site smelled like wet concrete, river mud, and overheated hydraulic fluid. A crane operator stood smoking beside a barrier wall with his hard hat resting at his feet. Malcolm noticed the man's hands trembling slightly around the cigarette. Nobody was sleeping much anymore. Inside the trailer, digital models of the bridge glowed across 3 monitors. Red stress lines spread through the rotating center span like fractures inside glass. Dana pointed at the screen. The latest torque simulation predicts another hydraulic push could shear the locking collar entirely. How confident? 78%. Malcolm stared at the numbers. 78% wasn't engineering confidence. It was gambling with expensive vocabulary. "What's the alternative?" he asked. Dana folded her arms. "We stabilize the counterweight assembly manually, reduce rotational resistance, then attempt a controlled reset using synchronized hydraulic pullers." Malcolm looked toward the bridge through the rain-streaked trailer window. "That'll take days." "We don't have days." She didn't say the rest out loud. Every hour the shipping lane stayed blocked, cost the state close to $400,000 in delayed freight movement, fuel rerouting, and port congestion. National media had already picked up the story. By tomorrow morning politicians would arrive, then cameras, then blame. A loud metallic crack echoed across the river. Everyone in the trailer froze. Not an explosion, not a collapse, something worse. A stressed sound. Deep, structural. Dana turned immediately. Where did that come from? Before anyone answered, radios erupted simultaneously. "West lock chamber just shifted. Negative, negative, hold position. We got movement on the lower rack. Everybody clear the platform." The trailer door burst open. Rain hit sideways now. Malcolm ran behind Dana toward the river platform, while workers scattered off the rotating span access deck. One of the floodlights flickered against the fog, throwing huge distorted shadows across the bridge structure. Then he saw it. The western counterweight housing had sunk another inch, maybe less, but enough. Enough to change load distribution across a 70-year-old rotating bridge designed by engineers who were already dead before Malcolm Reed was born. "Kill hydraulic pressure," Dana shouted. "We already did." The entire structure groaned again. Malcolm felt it through the soles of his boots. That scared him more than the sound itself. Bridges weren't supposed to feel alive. Across the lower maintenance platform, a group of welders and dock mechanics stood behind the safety barriers watching silently. One of them caught Malcolm's attention immediately. Old black man. Heavy canvas coat. Gray beard cut close to the skin. Worn leather gloves darkened by grease instead of age. He stood completely still while everyone else. Not nervous, not impressed. Just watching the bridge with an expression Malcolm couldn't read. The man tilted his head slightly. Then he spoke quietly, mostly to himself. The left pivot bearings carrying too much side load. Malcolm turned. What? The old man pointed toward the bridge. Your hydraulic team keeps trying to force rotation. Nobody answered him. Rain ticked against metal railings around them. The old man kept staring at the bridge. That structure ain't resisting force. He paused. It's resisting direction. One of the younger engineers nearby gave a tired laugh. Yeah, and who are you supposed to be? The old man finally looked away from the bridge. Elijah Brooks, the engineer shrugged. Well, Elijah Brooks, unless you've got $70 million and a replacement bridge hidden in your truck, I think we're good. A couple workers laughed weakly. Not because it was funny. Because exhausted people laugh when they're scared. Elijah didn't react. His eyes drifted back toward the bridge. You keep pulling like that, he said softly. You're gonna tear the rack teeth clean off the swing assembly. Dana stepped closer. You worked on bridges before? Elijah nodded once. Long time ago. What kind? River rotation systems. The younger engineer smirked. Sure you did. Malcolm noticed something strange then. Elijah wasn't looking at the damage section the way curious people look at disasters. He was tracing load paths. His eyes moved slowly across connection points, support housings, rotational anchors. Like someone reading a language. Another metallic groan rolled through the bridge. This time louder. One of the hydraulic technicians swore under his breath. Dana grabbed the radio from her belt. Shut down all active pressure systems now. I want full lockout, Static answered. Then too late, the sound that followed didn't feel real. A violent steel pop echoed across the river as one of the temporary restraint braces snapped loose from the western guide assembly. The bridge lurched half an inch sideways. Workers ran. Someone screamed. A maintenance cart tipped against the rail and crashed into the water below. Floodlights swung wildly through the fog, while alarms began screaming across the platform. Malcolm felt cold spread through his chest. Not panic. Recognition. They were losing control of the structure. Dana stared at the bridge with the expression of someone watching a patient bleed out during surgery. And beside Malcolm, Elijah Brooks quietly removed one grease-stained glove. Then he said the strangest thing anyone had heard all week. You're trying to hold the bridge still. Rainwater dripped from the brim of his old canvas cap. That's your mistake. Another deep vibration rolled through the structure. Elijah looked toward the river, toward the current, toward the giant frozen bridge hanging above black water and tension and millions of pounds of steel. Then he spoke again. You need to let it move. The entire platform went silent. Even the alarms suddenly felt farther away. Dana turned slowly toward him. What did you just say? Elijah looked back at the bridge one more time. And for the first time since Malcolm arrived at the site, the old man smiled, very slightly, like he'd finally recognized an old problem he hadn't seen in years. Nobody slept after the second shift failure. By 3 a.m, the rain had weakened into a mist that drifted low across the river. But the bridge still groaned every few minutes, like something enormous breathing in pain. Portable floodlights washed the steel structure in pale white glare, while Coast Guard boats floated below, with rotating amber lights reflecting across black water. Malcolm sat alone on an overturned equipment case beside the operations trailer, with a stale turkey sandwich untouched in his lap. He couldn't stop thinking about the old man. You need to let it move, not because it sounded dramatic, because it sounded specific. Engineers loved certainty. Real certainty usually sounded boring, technical, unemotional. And Elijah Brooks had spoken the way experienced mechanics spoke, when they already knew where the failure lived, before touching the machine. Malcolm rubbed his eyes and opened the bridge schematics again. The Jefferson Drawbridge had been built in 1948 by the Gulf River Transport Authority. Unlike modern vertical lift bridges, it rotated horizontally on a massive center pivot bearing system designed to distribute weight through a circular rack assembly beneath the deck. Simple in theory, terrifying in practice. Especially after 70 years of corrosion, retrofits, overloaded freight traffic, and deferred maintenance budgets, passed through 5 governors and 12 city councils. A cold wind drifted through the site. Nearby, somebody laughed too loudly at a joke that wasn't funny. Exhaustion was changing people. Malcolm looked back toward the river. Elijah was still there, same canvas coat, same gloves. Sitting quietly on an old red toolbox near the maintenance platform while everyone else rushed between radios, laptops, and hydraulic diagrams. The old man hadn't tried to impress anyone, hadn't asked for attention, hadn't repeated himself once. That bothered Malcolm more than confidence would have. Dana stepped out of the trailer carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Malcolm without speaking. He took it. Cold already. You trust him? She asked. Malcolm stared toward the river. I don't know, that's not an answer. He noticed the side load imbalance before our simulation team did. Dana crossed her arms against the wind. One correct observation doesn't make him a structural savior. No, Malcolm looked at the bridge again. But he talks like somebody who's touched these systems before. For several seconds, only generators answered them. Then Dana sighed quietly. You know what scares me? What? That he might be right. The bridge groaned again, lower this time, metal under strain. Somewhere on the upper catwalk, a worker shouted for a thermal camera reading. Malcolm stood. I'm gonna talk to him. Dana didn't stop him. That surprised him too. Elijah Brooks was sitting exactly where Malcolm left him 20 minutes earlier, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the river current beneath the bridge. Up close, Malcolm noticed details he'd missed before. The old man's gloves had welding burns along the fingertips. His boots were resoled by hand. A small brass mechanical pencil sat clipped inside his coat pocket beside a folded paper notebook swollen from moisture and age, not decorative, used. You waiting for somebody? Malcolm asked. Elijah shook his head once. Waiting for the bridge. Malcolm almost smiled. Mind if I sit? You groan, do what you want. Malcolm sat beside him on the damp steel beam. For a while neither man spoke. River traffic lights blinked red in the distance through fog. Finally Malcolm asked, how'd you know about the side load? Elijah kept watching the bridge. Sound. The sound? That's it? That's enough. Malcolm frowned slightly. Elijah glanced at him. You hear engines different after enough years too. The old man pointed toward the bridge. Steel talk same way. Malcolm looked back toward the massive structure stretching over the river. You really worked on these systems? A few. When? Long time ago. You keep saying that. Elijah finally leaned back slightly. You always ask this many questions? I'm trying to figure out if you're crazy. That earned the first real reaction from Elijah. A small laugh. Dry and short, that's fair. Malcolm waited. The old man rubbed his thumb slowly against one burned glove fingertip. I worked river structures down south after Katrina. You were with the Corps? Elijah nodded. Army Corps Subcontract Division. Malcolm blinked. That was not small work. The Corps handled some of the most difficult structural recovery operations in the country. What was your position? Elijah shrugged once. Mechanical systems, that can mean anything. It usually means nobody notices you until something stops moving. Malcolm laughed softly before he could stop himself. Then he realized Elijah wasn't joking. Wind rattled loose caution tape nearby. Across the platform, a hydraulic team rolled another pressure cart toward the West Assembly housing, while Dana argued with someone over radio communications. Elijah watched them for several seconds. They still think force solves everything. Malcolm followed his gaze. Well, force usually helps, no. Elijah shook his head slowly. Direction helps. The old man pointed toward the bridge center pivot. Your people keep trying to overpower resistance. What should they do? They should understand why the resistance exists first. Malcolm stared at him. Again, it was the specificity. Not motivational wisdom, not movie dialogue. Engineering logic. Real engineering logic. Elijah reached into his coat and pulled out the small notebook Malcolm noticed earlier. Water-stained pages, hand sketches. He opened to a rough pencil drawing of a rotating bridge assembly. Then another, all old, very old. Malcolm leaned closer. These are Jefferson pivot layouts? Elijah nodded. You drew these? Years ago. Malcolm looked again. The sketches weren't hobby drawings, they were field notes. Bearing tolerances, load paths, counterweight adjustments, torque direction arrows. And in the corner of one page sat a faded engineering stamp partially smeared by age. E. Brooks's mechanical knife specialist. Malcolm's chest tightened slightly. You actually worked on this bridge. Elijah closed the notebook. Not this one. Then how do you know the system? Because they all borrowed from the same mistakes. Before Malcolm could ask another question, shouting erupted near the west maintenance deck. Both men stood immediately. A crane-mounted inspection camera had just lowered beneath the bridge housing, and workers were suddenly crowding around the monitor feed. Dana waved Malcolm over. You need to see this. The monitor flickered through static before stabilizing. Then the entire group fell silent. The lower rack teeth inside the swing assembly were fractured. Not fully broken, but cracked. 3 of them. Hairline failures spreading through the steel like spiderwebs. Malcolm felt his stomach drop. If those teeth sheared completely during another forced rotation attempt, the entire bridge span could shift uncontrollably off-center. Not collapse immediately. Something worse. Partial structural release, unpredictable movement. The kind engineers hated most. Dana looked pale under the floodlights. How bad? She asked quietly. One of the structural analysts swallowed hard. If the crack propagates under hydraulic load, To finish, he didn't need to. Everyone understood. Another forced push could destroy the rotational assembly permanently. The bridge wouldn't reopen for months, possibly years. Silence settled across the platform again. Then Elijah spoke from behind them. You got old steel carrying new stress. Nobody mocked him this time. The old man stepped closer to the monitor. These teeth weren't designed for synchronized hydraulic forcing. One analyst frowned. That system upgrade happened in 1994. Elijah nodded. Yeah, you know about that too? I warned somebody not to do it. Malcolm turned sharply. What? Elijah kept studying the monitor. They wanted faster rotation speeds for heavier freight schedules. He tapped the cracked gear image gently. So they taught the bridge how to move faster. The old man looked up slowly, but they never taught it how to grow younger. Nobody spoke. Somewhere beyond the fog a barge horn echoed through the river darkness. Long, low, lonely. Dana stared at Elijah now with an entirely different expression than before. Not respect yet. Something more dangerous. Recognition. Who exactly are you? She asked. Elijah looked at the fractured gear teeth on the monitor one last time. Then he answered quietly. I'm the reason that upgrade still lasted 30 years. The entire platform went dead silent. And for the first time since the disaster began, someone on that site finally understood. They had been standing next to the most important man in Louisiana, without even knowing it. By sunrise, nobody at the Jefferson site was pretending this was a normal recovery operation anymore. News vans lined the outer barricades along Riverfront Avenue. State transportation officials walked around in clean boots, trying not to step in mud while reporters rehearsed dramatic stand-ups beside generators and flashing emergency lights. Behind them, the bridge remained frozen over the Mississippi like a wounded animal too dangerous to touch. And somewhere inside the rotating assembly, 3 cracked rack teeth waited to decide whether the structure survived the week. Malcolm stood inside the operations trailer staring at Elijah Brooks' old field notebook spread across the table. The pages smelled faintly of machine oil and river dampness. Dana leaned beside him, reading silently. He documented the hydraulic retrofit, she said quietly. Malcolm nodded. He knew the stress transfer problem before it happened. On the page sat a pencil note written beside an old mechanical sketch. Force-synchronized rotation will shift side load in 8 rack teeth during uneven crest shore. Below it another line. Bridge will survive until the river asks for more than the steel remembers. Dana exhaled slowly. That doesn't even sound like engineering. No, Malcolm said. It sounds like experience. Outside, another helicopter passed overhead toward the river. The governor was arriving in less than 2 hours, which meant urban access had less than 2 hours before politics replaced engineering entirely. Dana closed the notebook carefully. Find Elijah. Why? Because if he's right. She looked through the trailer window toward the bridge. Then we've been trying to save this structure the wrong way for 3 straight days. Malcolm found Elijah sitting under the maintenance scaffold near the lower service dock drinking coffee from a dented metal thermos. Not rushing. Not watching the media. Just sitting quietly while rainwater dripped from rusted beams overhead. You disappeared, Malcolm said. Elijah shrugged. Lot of loud people up there. Malcolm sat beside him. You knew the retrofit would fail eventually. Elijah unscrewed the thermos lid slowly, not fail. He took a sip. Fatigue. That's basically the same thing, no. The old man looked toward the bridge. Failure sounds sudden. Fatigue takes years. Malcolm waited. Elijah pointed toward the rotating span. Every time that bridge opened under uneven river force, stress traveled through those rack teeth sideways instead of downward. He drew an invisible line in the air with one gloved finger. Steel likes carrying weight. Another line. Steel hates twisting. Malcolm frowned slightly. That's what cracked the assembly? No. Elijah looked back toward him. What cracked the assembly was 30 years of pretending the twisting wasn't happening. That sat heavily between them, because Malcolm knew he was right. Modern infrastructure failures rarely came from one disaster. Most of them came from decades of ignored warnings layered quietly on top of each other until one bad storm finally exposed the truth. A radio suddenly crackled nearby. Dana needs everyone inside now. Malcolm and Elijah exchanged a look. Something had changed. Inside the operations trailer, tension filled the room before anyone spoke. 2 new structural consultants stood beside the digital bridge model, while a legal representative from Urban Axis flipped through paperwork at the rear table. Dana looked exhausted, which meant the meeting was serious. One consultant tapped the monitor screen. We've run 6 new simulations. He enlarged the fractured rack assembly. The bridge is no longer stable under passive load conditions. Malcolm felt cold settle into his stomach. What does that mean exactly? It means the rotational tension inside the system is increasing on its own. Another engineer spoke. The river current is applying asymmetrical pressure against the locked span. So the bridge is still trying to rotate. The room went quiet. One of the legal representatives cleared his throat. If the damaged rack teeth shear completely, the west lock housing could release. And nobody answered immediately, because everybody in the room understood the implication already. Not total collapse. Something more dangerous, uncontrolled rotational release. The bridge could swing partially open under river pressure. Not fast. Not cinematic. Slow. Heavy. Unstoppable. Like a vault door breaking loose underwater. If that happened while a freight barge passed beneath the structure, people would die. Dana folded her arms tightly. What are our options? The consultants exchanged uncomfortable looks. Finally, one answered. We complete one final synchronized hydraulic reset before the fracture spreads. Malcolm stared at him. You still want to force rotation? It's the only available method within operational time constraints. Elijah spoke from the back corner. No. The room turned toward him immediately. The consultant frowned. Excuse me? You forced that bridge again. Elijah said calmly. You're gonna break the west rack clean through. The consultant's expression hardened instantly. With respect, sir, these calculations are based on advanced finite load structural modeling. Elijah nodded once. And your model's wrong. A few people shifted uncomfortably. The consultant laughed softly. You reviewed our simulations? No. Then, how exactly would you know they're wrong? Elijah looked toward the bridge through the rain-covered trailer window. Because your model thinks the bridge is standing still. Silence. Nobody interrupted him now. The river ain't standing still. He stepped toward the monitor. Currents hitting the south face harder every hour. Water pressures creating rotational memory inside the lock span. The consultant frowned harder. That's not a real engineering term. It is if you've repaired river bridges for 40 years. Elijah pointed toward the west housing. That structure's already trying to turn itself loose. Dana looked at the simulation screen again. Slowly. Thinking. Malcolm saw it happen in her eyes. Recognition, not emotional recognition, professional recognition. The terrifying moment a good engineer realizes someone else in the room understands the system better than they do. One consultant shook his head impatiently. We don't have time for folklore mechanics. Elijah didn't react. The consultant continued. We either attempt controlled release hydraulics now or risk catastrophic structural instability later. And if you're wrong? Malcolm asked quietly. Nobody answered him. Because engineers hated probabilities when human lives sat underneath them. Dana finally spoke. How long before fracture propagation becomes critical? The consultant checked his notes. Maybe 6 hours. The room tightened instantly. 6 hours, that was all. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere upriver. Then another sound followed it. Lower, metallic. Deep enough to vibrate the trailer floor. Everybody froze. The bridge had moved again. Not much, but enough for every loose coffee cup inside the trailer to tremble slightly against the tables. One worker whispered, Jesus. A radio exploded with static. West Assembly just shifted another 1/4 inch. Pressure spike on lower rack. We got the deformation increasing near the lock collar. Dana grabbed the radio. Evacuate upper maintenance deck immediately. People moved fast now. Real fear finally replacing procedure. Outside the trailer windows, workers hurried across rain-soaked catwalks while warning alarms began flashing across the bridge again. Elijah never moved. He just kept watching the structure, like a doctor listening to a patient's breathing. Dana turned toward him slowly. If we don't force rotation. Elijah answered before she finished. You stopped fighting the bridge. Rain hammered harder now against the trailer roof. And then what? Dana asked. For the first time since Malcolm met him. Elijah Brooks looked tired. Not physically. Emotionally. Like someone reopening a door he buried years ago. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old folded photograph. Black and white. Creased from decades. He handed it to Malcolm. 5 men stood beside a giant river bridge under construction sometime in the 1970s. Young, greasy, smiling. And standing in the center beside the rotating assembly was Elijah. Only younger. Stronger. Wearing the situation. Malcolm looked closer. One of the other men in the photo had his arm around Elijah's shoulder. What happened to him? Elijah stared at the bridge. He died because somebody forced a structure that wanted to move another way. The room fell silent again. Then Elijah looked back toward Dana. And quietly said the sentence that changed everything. You don't need more force. Another metallic groan rolled across the river. Elijah's eyes never left the bridge. You need to change where the bridge thinks its weight belongs. At 1:14 p.m. the governor's convoy arrived. Black SUVs, state police motorcycles. umbrellas opening in synchronized motion beneath cold Louisiana rain. By then, nobody at the Jefferson site cared anymore. The bridge had shifted another half-inch. The western lock collar temperature was climbing steadily from internal friction stress. And somewhere deep inside the swing assembly, cracked steel teeth were slowly grinding themselves toward failure. The media crews loved it. Disaster always looked better in rain. Malcolm stood near the lower operations platform, watching reporters film the leaning bridge, while pretending not to notice the workers behind them, smoking through panic and exhaustion. One camera operator zoomed toward Elijah Brooks sitting alone beneath the scaffold, then zoomed away. Nobody looking at him would guess he was the only person there who truly understood what the bridge was doing. That felt wrong somehow. Inside the command trailer, the atmosphere had changed completely. Nobody argued now. Fear had burned the arrogance out of the room. Dana stood at the central monitor while state officials pressed for answers she couldn't honestly give. How long until failure? One asked. We don't know. That's not acceptable. No, Dana replied quietly. It isn't. Malcolm noticed something important then. Dana had stopped protecting urban access. She was protecting the bridge. That mattered. One of the consultants pointed toward the simulation screen again. We still have a narrow operational window for synchronized hydraulic release. Elijah stood near the back wall with his arms folded. No, you don't. The consultant exhaled sharply. You keep saying that without offering a viable engineering alternative. Elijah finally looked at him directly. I already gave you one. Changing load direction is not a recovery plan. No, Elijah said calmly. It's physics. The consultant laughed once in frustration. So what exactly are you proposing? Elijah stepped toward the bridge model. Not dramatic, not angry, just certain. He pointed toward the center rotational housing. The bridge isn't locked because it's too heavy. His finger moved toward the South River side. It's locked because the current shifted the center of resistance. Nobody interrupted him. Even the governor's transportation advisor stayed quiet. Elijah pointed toward the West Assembly. You force hydraulic rotation against that pressure. All the load transfers sideways into the cracked rack teeth. Malcolm watched the room carefully. Some people still doubted him, but nobody was dismissing him anymore. Elijah grabbed a marker from the table. Then he did something unexpected. He drew. Not equations, not simulations. Simple force lines, river pressure, weight distribution, rotational leverage. You keep trying to overpower the bridge from the pivot, he said. That's backwards. He drew another line extending outward. The bridge already wants to move. Another line. You just need to teach the weight where to go. Silence settled again. Then Malcolm slowly realized what Elijah meant. Not lifting, not forcing, redirecting. Dana saw it at almost the same moment. Her eyes narrowed slightly toward the drawing. You want to reduce rotational resistance indirectly. Elijah nodded once. Now you're listening. The consultant frowned. How? Elijah pointed toward the river outside. You use the current that triggered immediate reactions. One official shook his head instantly. That's insane. Another engineer jumped in. You can't intentionally destabilize a compromised structure over active water. Elijah stayed calm, already unstable. Nobody answered him, because again, he was right. The bridge was already moving. The difference was whether they controlled the movement or waited for the river to control it for them. Dana looked toward Malcolm. You seeing this? He nodded slowly, and he was. Not fully. Not yet. But enough to understand Elijah wasn't improvising. This was experience, hard-earned experience. The kind written in scar tissue instead of textbooks. Outside, thunder rolled again. A maintenance worker suddenly burst into the trailer. We got another pressure spike. Everyone moved immediately. The Western Support housing camera feed flickered onto the main monitor. The cracked rack teeth were widening. Tiny vibrations moved through the steel every few seconds. The bridge was literally tearing itself apart in slow motion. The room went silent. Then Dana turned toward Elijah. What do you need? The question changed everything. Elijah didn't answer immediately. He looked out toward the river through rain-covered glass. Thinking, remembering. Finally he spoke. You got any old diesel tugs still working this river? One of the port officials blinked. What? I said old diesel tugs. We have modern push boats on standby, no computers? No automatic thrust stabilization, no. Elijah nodded slowly. Good. The consultant stared at him in disbelief. You want tugboats involved in a structurally compromised bridge recovery? No. Elijah looked back toward the bridge. I want the river involved. 40 minutes later, the site looked completely different. Not cleaner, not calmer. Different, purposeful. The media helicopters still circled overhead. But now workers moved with the sharp focus of people following a plan instead of reacting to disaster. Malcolm walked beside Elijah across the soaked maintenance deck while crews repositioned lighting towers near the river edge. "You've done this before," Malcolm said quietly. Elijah kept walking. "Once." "What happened?" The old man didn't answer for several seconds. Rain tapped softly against steel around them. Finally, 1987. Mobile River. Malcolm waited. "Cargo bridge lock failure after flood surge. What do you do?" "Same thing." And Elijah stopped walking. For the first time since Malcolm met him, the old man looked haunted. "Structure survived. That's good, isn't it?" Elijah stared toward the river. Not everybody did. Before Malcolm could respond, Dana called from the lower dock. "You need to see this." Down by the riverbank, workers had cleared space beside an old rust-covered vessel tied near the emergency dock. Malcolm stared at it, then blinked. The thing looked ancient. Faded blue paint. Massive mechanical winch drums. Manual throttle controls. No digital modern automation. Just steel. Engine. Wait. A worker nearby laughed quietly. "That old thing still runs?" The tug captain overheard him. "Boy," he muttered. "This boat was pushing barges before your daddy got his first apartment." Elijah stepped onto the dock and placed one weathered hand against the side of the old tugboat. Almost gently, like greeting an old animal. "Malcolm asked?" The captain answered proudly, "Magnolia Queen." Elijah nodded once. "Good boat." The captain studied him carefully. "You know her?" "Worked beside her years ago." The old captain squinted harder. Then his eyes widened slightly. "Wait," he stepped closer. "Elijah Brooks?" Elijah sighed softly. "Been a while, Raymond." The captain suddenly laughed in disbelief. "Well, I'll be damned." That reaction caught everybody's attention instantly. Even Dana looked surprised. "You know him?" she asked. Captain Raymond Turner stared at Elijah like he'd just seen a ghost. "Know him?" He pointed toward the bridge. "That man kept the Port Allen crossing from collapsing during the flood of '87. The dock went silent. Raymond shook his head slowly. Whole state thought that bridge was done. He looked back at Elijah. "You disappeared after that." Elijah didn't answer. The captain's expression softened slightly. "Heard about Marcus." Something changed in Elijah's face then. Very small. But Malcolm saw it. Pain. Old pain. The kind people learn to carry quietly because they have no other choice. Elijah looked away toward the river. That was a long time ago. Nobody pushed further. The rain eased slightly overhead. And for one strange moment in the middle of disaster and politics and millions of dollars hanging over the river, the entire recovery operation became deeply personal. Because now Malcolm finally understood something terrifying. Elijah Brooks wasn't trying to save the bridge to prove he was smart. He was trying to stop history from happening twice. And somewhere deep beneath the Jefferson drawbridge, old steel kept groaning in the dark. The Mississippi River looked black under the storm clouds. Not dark, black, like oil moving beneath the bridge. By 6:40 p.m., every non-essential worker had been evacuated from the Jefferson site. State police pushed reporters behind the secondary barricades while emergency floodlights turned the entire riverfront into a pale industrial ghost town of steel, rain, and diesel smoke. Nobody said it out loud anymore, but everyone understood the truth. If Elijah Brooks was wrong, the bridge would likely destroy itself before sunrise. Malcolm stood on the lower maintenance deck, fastening his rain jacket tighter, while workers connected massive steel cables from the Magnolia Queen to temporary anchor points along the south span. Not to pull the bridge open. That was the part outsiders couldn't understand. The tugboat wasn't there to overpower the structure. It was there to change the direction of force slowly enough for the bridge to stop fighting itself. Dana stepped beside Malcolm holding a soaked clipboard under one arm. "You nervous?" she asked. He laughed once. "Honestly? Yeah, I think we crossed nervous 6 hours ago." That earned the first tired smile Malcolm had seen from her all week. Behind them, Elijah walked slowly across the platform checking cable angles himself. No computer, no digital model, just his eyes, his hands, and 50 years of understanding how steel behaved when fear entered the equation. Workers moved differently around him now. Nobody mocked him anymore. Nobody questioned why he was there. Because competence changes the atmosphere around a person. People feel it before they fully understand it. Captain Raymond leaned out from the Magnolia Queen wheelhouse. "We're ready whenever you are." Elijah raised one hand without looking up. Then he crouched near the south locking assembly and pressed 2 fingers against the steel housing, feeling vibration. Listening. The rain softened briefly overhead. Malcolm walked toward him carefully. "You really think this'll work?" Elijah stayed crouched for a moment longer, then quietly answered, "No." Malcolm blinked. "No?" Elijah stood slowly. "I think it might work." That honesty hit harder than confidence would have. The old man looked toward the bridge. "Anybody tells you they know exactly what old steel's gonna do under stress. He shook his head once. They lying. A deep metallic groan rolled through the structure again. Longer this time. Elijah looked toward the current. River's changing, how can you tell? She sounds faster. Malcolm almost asked how a river could sound fast. Then he stopped himself. Because Elijah wasn't speaking poetically. He meant it literally. The governor's transportation advisor approached carefully through the rain. We need an answer now. Elijah didn't turn around. You already got one. This operation hasn't been approved by state review. Dana stepped in immediately, then stop standing here and approve it. The man hesitated. You're willing to stake your company on this? Dana looked toward the bridge, then toward Elijah, then back at the official. No, her voice stayed calm. I'm willing to stake my integrity on listening to the right person. That silenced him. The rain started falling harder again. Floodlights reflected off the river like broken glass. Elijah finally climbed the lower service ladder toward the central platform. Every movement looked slower now, more deliberate. His knees clearly hurt. One hand stayed near the rail longer than before. Age was winning little battles against him everywhere. But not here. Not tonight. Tonight he still belonged to the river. At 7:12 p.m., Elijah gave the signal. The Magnolia Queen's diesel engines rumbled deeper across the water, not aggressive, controlled. The heavy cables tightened gradually, no sudden movement, no jerking force, just pressure, slow and patient. The bridge groaned instantly. Metal answering tension. Workers watched silently from the outer platforms while Malcolm stared at the live sensor feeds inside the operations trailer. Load pressure was shifting, exactly like Elijah predicted. The consultant who mocked him earlier leaned closer to the monitor. What the hell? The west rack pressure numbers began dropping, not quickly, but steadily. Elijah's voice crackled through the radio. Little more starboard thrust. Captain Raymond answered immediately. Copy. The Magnolia Queen adjusted angles slightly against the river current. Another deep vibration rolled through the bridge. Then suddenly, a loud metallic snap echoed across the water. Everybody froze. One of the technicians shouted, "Pressure spike!" The bridge lurched half an inch sideways. Alarms exploded across the site. The consultant turned pale. We're losing the rack. Dana grabbed the radio. Elijah, abort now. No answer. Malcolm looked through the rain toward the central platform. Elijah wasn't moving. He stood beside the railing, staring down toward the lower assembly, listening. Then finally his voice came through the radio. Quiet, steady. That wasn't the rack. Another pause. That was the restraint brace letting go. The old man looked toward the tugboat. Again, the Magnolia Queen pushed harder. This time the bridge moved, not much, but enough for everybody to feel it. A low grinding vibration rolled beneath the entire structure, while the giant span shifted against the current for the first time in 4 days. Inside the trailer, numbers began changing rapidly. Rotational resistance dropping. Rack pressure stabilizing. Load transfer redistributing. The consultant whispered softly. Impossible, no, Malcolm realized. Not impossible, mechanical. The bridge suddenly groaned louder than before, then moved another inch. Workers backed away instinctively as 70 years of frozen tension slowly began releasing through the structure. Elijah's voice crackled again. Now. At the north support platform, workers released 2 secondary cable locks simultaneously. The effect was immediate. The bridge shifted sharply, then stopped. Then, for one terrifying second, the entire structure seemed to float, not physically, emotionally, like the bridge itself had forgotten where its weight belonged. Malcolm stopped breathing. Everybody did. Then the current caught the south span exactly the way Elijah intended. A deep rolling vibration thundered across the river as the bridge slowly rotated back towards center alignment. Not forced, guided. The cracked rack assembly screamed against steel. Floodlights shook. Workers stared in complete silence, and inch by inch, the bridge returned home. Nobody cheered immediately. Nobody moved. They just watched the impossible happen, in total disbelief, while rainwater streamed down their faces. The Jefferson drawbridge locked into alignment with a final deafening clang that echoed across the Mississippi like a cannon shot. Then silence, pure silence. Even the river sounded quieter somehow. Inside the operations trailer, every monitor turned green. Structural pressure stabilized, rotational lock secured, critical stress levels falling. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then one exhausted welder sitting near the rear wall started clapping slowly. One clap, then another. Then the entire trailer. Workers shouting, laughing, crying, hard hats hitting tables. Somebody grabbed Malcolm in a hug he never saw coming. Outside, tugboat horns blasted across the river, long, triumphant. The governor himself stood speechless beneath an umbrella, while cameras captured the bridge sitting perfectly aligned against the storm-dark skyline. But Elijah Brooks was already walking away. Malcolm spotted him crossing the lower maintenance deck alone while everyone else celebrated behind him. The old man moved slowly now. Like the adrenaline was finally leaving his body. Malcolm hurried after him. Elijah! The old man stopped near the river railing. Rain dripped from the brim of his cap. You're leaving? Bridge don't need me anymore. Malcolm caught up beside him, breathing hard. You saved it. Elijah looked toward the water. No. He shook his head once. We listened to it. That answer stayed with Malcolm longer than anything else. The celebration behind them grew louder. Reporters, officials, executives, everybody suddenly wanting proximity to the miracle. But Elijah stayed facing the river, quiet again, like he already belonged somewhere else. Malcolm finally asked the question he'd been carrying all day. Why did you disappear after 87? Elijah's eyes stayed on the water. For several seconds Malcolm thought he wouldn't answer. Then, Marcus was my partner. The rain softened around them. We saved the bridge. A pause. But we forced the final lock too early. Malcolm felt cold settle in his chest. Elijah continued quietly. Support arm failed. Another pause. He died before rescue boats reached him. The sounds of celebration behind them suddenly felt far away. I spent 20 years thinking engineering was about control. Elijah rubbed his thumb slowly against one burned glove fingertip. Marcus taught me too late. He looked toward the restored bridge. Sometimes structures survive when you stop trying to dominate them. Neither man spoke for a while. The river moved beneath them in darkness, alive, ancient, patient. Finally Malcolm asked softly, So why come back? Elijah smiled faintly. Because I got tired of watching people mistake computers for wisdom. That night the Jefferson Drawbridge reopened at 2:11 a.m. The first freight train crossed slowly under floodlights, while workers lined both sides of the structure in silence, watching steel wheels pass over rails nobody believed would survive the storm. Malcolm stood near the center lock assembly, holding Elijah's old field notebook in one hand. The pages were damp now, softened from rain and years and work. At the bottom of the final page, written in faded pencil beneath decades of calculations and sketches, sat a single sentence. Old things don't break because they're old. They break because people forget how they were meant to carry weight. Malcolm read it twice, then folded the notebook carefully closed. By sunrise Elijah Brooks was gone. No interviews, no press conference, no television appearance. Just tire tracks from an old pickup truck disappearing into wet Louisiana roads, while news helicopters circled above the bridge he quietly saved. 3 months later, Malcolm visited a small repair yard near Plaquemine after hearing rumors from tugboat crews. He found Elijah exactly where he expected, under an old diesel engine with grease on his hands. Working, no cameras, no audience, just tools. Malcolm stood there for a moment before speaking. You ever think about coming back? Elijah slid out slowly from beneath the engine, never left. Then he handed Malcolm a wrench, and for the first time in his career, Malcolm Reed stopped feeling like an engineer with software, and started feeling like a man, learning how weight really moves through the world. Disclaimer. This story is a fictionalized dramatic narrative inspired by real-world bridge recovery operations, aging American infrastructure systems, and the overlooked expertise of field mechanics, welders, operators and structural workers whose experience often prevents disasters long before the public ever notices. Some technical details, characters, and events were adapted for cinematic storytelling. The intention of this story is not to exaggerate heroism, but to honor practical knowledge, humility, and the human side of engineering.